Okay, so this video is going to give you an idea of the most important parts of what you read for class, just in case we don't have school. So we're going to talk about first the types of interest groups, and they can be broadly broken down into four categories. So they can be economic in nature, they can be environmental, they can be seeking equality for certain minority groups, or they could be advocating for the consumer or public interest. So there's some examples of some major interest groups down here. The National Organization for Women can be seen as a minority interest group. National Rifle Association, you could say that this is a public interest group. Greenpeace is an environmental group, and the American Federation of Labor is an economic interest group. So we'll start first with the economic ones. Um, so economic interest groups tend to be most influenced, the most numerous, that is, out of all the kinds of interest groups that we'll talk about. And this is because they have many prominent economic concerns. They are interested in wages, prices, and profits. And to them, they can influence the government to give them more favorable regulations, to implement or take away tax policies. They can issue subsidies for certain types of businesses. So you're going to see that various categories of people or laborers are going to get involved in some type of economic interest group. Okay, so we're talking about the businesses in general. We can talk about laborers. We could also talk about something more specific like farmers. All of them are going to worry about government regulation because ultimately it could affect their economic livelihood, right? So we see a various number of people getting involved in interest groups for economic reasons. Every economic group wants to get its fair share of direct aid in government contracts as well. So again, there's a huge economic incentive to joining these types of interest groups. And all different types of people who join economic interest groups are concerned with government regulations, taxes, subsidies, and even international economic policy, because all of these things can affect how much money is coming into their business. So these are the various reasons why there's so many people who are involved in economic interest groups. Um, so the two different kinds of economic interest groups, and they're very different. Okay, the first one is labor. Okay, so basically you're going to see that most labor interest groups take the form of unions, right? And the largest labor interest group is the AFL-CIO, which which you could consider in effect a union of unions. It's a very large organization of union members. So that in itself is a union that has a bunch of unions in it. There are also some interest groups that have much more specific uh, types of labor in mind. Okay, so they're kind of broken up by field, so to speak. So the National Education Association is one, Teamsters, and Service Employees International Union. So you see how these are much more specific than the AFL-CIO. So basically, what are they trying to do? They want to improve working conditions and they want to improve wages, right? So you're going to see that there are kind of two different things that have happened to labor interest groups um, based particularly on these two goals, right? Um, in some instances, there are workers that want to get union benefits, but they don't actually want to join the union because you have to pay to join a union. So the way in which organizations have combated that is that they've established what are called union shops. Okay, what union shops do is they require employees to join a union as a condition of their employment. So if you refuse to join a union, you're not going to have your job anymore, right? So this is basically going to protect the interests of every member of the union. So everybody gets the benefits of the union if they work for a particular organization. There's no one who can kind of free ride off of those union benefits. However, there's a different approach, and this is encouraged by the businesses themselves, not the laborers. Okay, so union shops is something that was kind of brought about by businesses to help all of the laborers, whereas right to work laws are something that businesses have established. All right, so what right to work laws do is it completely outlaws union membership. Right, and this started with the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, which allowed states to adopt right to work laws. But the thing that we have to think about here is how and why right to work laws were adapted and the effect that this has on union membership and workers' rights. In particular, we should think about a state like Wisconsin, where you see numerous protests for um, for collective bargaining rights. So right to work states could experience certainly a lot of sort of pushback towards the government, and the desire to at least have the option of joining a union. What we're going to see, partly due to right to work laws, but also due to some other elements, which I'll talk about in a second, in the private blue collar sector, you're going to see a steady decline of union membership, basically since the 1950s. And some of this has to do with the fact that other countries have fairly low wages, especially in developing countries. So, what does this do? This creates competition, right? American companies must compete with foreign markets who have lower labor costs. And so this makes them lower their prices, and this makes basically less of an incentive to allow workers to join a union. So basically, their wages are going to have to compete with the low wages of foreign countries to basically allow that industry to sustain. Think about how many industries now outsource their labor just because of cost, right? However, we are going to see that in the public sector, there is an increase in union membership. Okay, and some of this has to do with the fact that many states are facing declining revenues, and so they are tightening their budgets. So, in a way, we can then see that increased union membership can kind of be a reaction to this pattern. They don't want the tightened budgets to affect how much their wages are. So, ultimately, their response to this is to join a union. We're also going to see in the public sector a number of increased battles between union members and states for collective bargaining rights. Okay, so like I said before, Wisconsin and Indiana is another prominent example. Okay. Business interest groups, okay, so very different from labor interest groups. This actually makes up the vast majority of interest groups that have offices in Washington. About 70% of all interest groups um, are representing businesses, not laborers like we were just talking about, but businesses. All right, so you're going to see that most large corporations have offices in DC to protect their economic interests and monitor legislation. And we can see that because there's been a dramatic increase in business PACs. And really, that's more than any other category of PAC. So, business PACs are influencing politics and election outcomes more than any other type of PAC. Okay, business groups sometimes can actually compete in interest, so it's important to realize that not all businesses are kind of rallying together for the same causes. Okay, so an example here could be trucking and construction companies versus railroads, right? Obviously, railroads don't want an increase in the number of roads because less people would take public transit, right? But but construction companies want to limit the use of railroads so that more people are actually driving on the road. Makes sense. Um, you're going to see that one of the major things that business interest groups are going for is to fight regulations that would reduce their profits. Okay, they therefore are going to seek tax treat preferential tax treatments, and and also they're very concerned with tariffs, right? They want to make sure that their domestic interest is protected. So a lot of businesses actually are in favor of tariffs to a certain extent. Okay, next category, very different from business, environmental interests. Okay, so these are mostly newer organizations, all right? The only exception to that rule would be the Sierra Club and Audubon Society, which have been around much longer. But most interest groups really only started to take shape uh, after the first Earth Day, and that was in April of 1970. Um, so some of the growing environmental interest groups that we have now are the World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, and the National Wildlife Federation. It's also important to realize that some environmental interest groups actually have an international presence. So Greenpeace is an organization that actually is active both in the U.S., Germany, and the Netherlands. I believe they have headquarters in Amsterdam. So their agenda is pretty straightforward. Obviously, they want to protect the environment. So some of the things that they go for are pollution control, preventing global warming, protecting the wilderness, protecting endangered species, right? So the major policies they're going to be opposed to, things like oil drilling, nuclear power plants. So we can infer then that environmental interest groups likely played a significant role in the recent congressional decision uh, to uh, to not go through with the Keystone oil pipeline, right? There must have been environmental interest groups lobbying Congress to explain why this would be a bad policy because of all the economic, environmental effects that it would have. Um, they also sometimes push for policies that involve higher safety standards, and one of the most prominent examples of that is after the 3 Mile Island disaster. It was a nuclear power plant that it wasn't a complete meltdown, but it was a nuclear power kind of crisis, and because of that scare, environmental interest groups were able to kind of explain how important it is to to have high safety standards with nuclear power. Um, Another type of interest group, equality interests, okay, and these are interest groups that represent minorities as well as women. Even though women make up more than half the population, they're still considered minorities, right? The oldest existing equality interest group is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, and they have had most of their dominant goals have been for equality at the polls, in housing, and in education. And they are best known for their influence over the Brown versus Board decision in 1954. Remember how in our previous class we were talking about how in if you can't if you can't successfully lobby Congress or even use PACs to shape elections, you could influence legislation by going directly to the court. So litigation is another way that interest groups can be successful. Okay, so influencing Brown v. Board is a prominent example of how that works. They did not actually influence Congress first. That isn't until the 1960s that we see civil rights legislation. Instead, they go to the courts first. And the 1954 Brown v. Board decision was kind of a catalyst to the rest of the civil rights movement. All right, and even though Brown v. Board is done, obviously, and the civil rights legislation was passed in the 1960s, the NAACP is still influential, along with other equality interest groups. They shape policies like affirmative action, right? One example of this would be something called the Fair Share Program, which negotiates agreements with national and regional businesses to increase minority hiring and the use of minority contractors. So basically, affirmative action is not just education related, it can also deal with equality in the workplace. Now, the software that I am using to record this video lets me record 15-minute videos at the max. So I'm going to come back to you in just a few with part 2.